Welcome to What the F is Going On in Latin America and the Caribbean, Code Pink's weekly YouTube program of hot news out of Latin America and the Caribbean. In partnership with Friends of Latin America, Massachusetts Peace Action, and Task Force on the Americas, we broadcast every Wednesday on Code Pink YouTube at 4:30 p.m. Pacific, 7:30 p.m. Eastern. I'm happy to introduce to you this evening as my co-host, Yoav Elinevsky from Mass Peace Action, our new broadcast partner, in addition with Task Force on the Americas and Friends of Latin America. Welcome, Yoav, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. He will be co-hosting tonight. And I also want to introduce to you our guest. As you all know, tonight's program is entitled Alex Saab, Sanctions and the Extra-Judicial Reach of the United States. And the case of Alex Saab is a really important judicial subject for all of us to discuss, particularly how the US is behaving in this case. And so let me tell you a little bit about John, because I think you'll all be very impressed with his work and his history, his body of work. And then we'll have Yoav give us a bit of a background for all of you as to the Saab case and Venezuela and the Venezuela-US foreign relations situation, because that has so much to do with the current situation with Ambassador Saab. And then John can give us an update and answer questions, and put your questions in the YouTube chat, please, as to what is currently happening with Alex and where we go from here. So let me tell you a little bit about John. John is an experienced international defense attorney before the International Criminal Courts, ICC, ICTR, and in Canada. He has been active in Africa, Latin America, and Europe, as well as Canada. He's a frequently invited speaker at international conferences and webinars. He's an advisor on international legal issues to governments and non-governmental organizations. He's also a former judge at the Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Tribunal. He's a member of the Free Alex Saab Committee, which we will talk more about this evening as well. He's a member of the Free Alex Saab Committee of the Cross Canada Campaign to Free Meng Wanzhou, president of the Rwanda Political Prisoner Support Network, and he's also part of the coalition BDS Quebec. So, and you can find John at johnphilpot.com, and it's JOHNPHILPOP.com. So welcome, Yoav, and welcome, John. It's an honor to have you both with us this evening, and let's start our conversation.
Okay, thank you, Terry, and thank you, John. It's good to be here with you, because this is a very important issue that we are dealing with. This story exposed the lawlessness, the hypocrisy of the United States government, and the lie it spread around the world about what it is doing. And I just want to tell you the story very shortly about Alex Saab and the historical context to this story. So Alex Saab is a Venezuelan businessman and a diplomat. He was arrested, he was kidnapped and arrested on June 12, 2020, on the order of the US government, while his plane was on refueling stop in Cape Verde. He was forcibly removed from the plane, imprisoned and held under torturous conditions. It has been more than 400 days since Alex remains imprisoned. Alex was on his way to Iran on an official visit in search of food, medicine, and gasoline to alleviate the crisis in Venezuela resulted from the regime an extra-territorial sanction imposed by the United States to punish the people of Venezuela. We need to remember how devastating the sanctions are, where people have to wait for 9 hours on gas lines, when trucks cannot deliver food from the countryside because they don't have the diesel fuel. People cannot get medicine. to heal themselves. And it caused, as we all know, by a study that was done by Mark Weisbrot and Jeffrey Sachs, they calculated that between 2017 and 2018, 40,000 Venezuelans died as a result of the sanctions. Well, this is 3 years later. You can do the calculation, and we can see the devastation here. We must see also that it was the Trump administration that ordered the arrest of Alex Saab, and I just found out that, as a matter of fact, at one point, the U.S. sent Navy warships to go to the island to keep an eye on Alex Saab. Now, I just want to give a very brief, maybe one more thing before I talk about the U.S.-Venezuela relationship. I think that maybe John can also discuss this fact that the United States is now planning to build a $350–400 million embassy in Cape Verde, a country of no more than 100,000 people. So and then some of this money will go to benefit some elites in Cape Verde. And this is in return for arresting Alex Saab. Okay, very briefly, historical context. 1999, Chavez is elected to president of Venezuela. 3 years later, under Bush, there is a coup against Chavez. He was arrested for 47 hours. And if it wasn't for the masses in Venezuela that went to the street, went in Caracas to the presidential palace, and demanded the return of Chavez, he would be done with in 3 years after his election. But this was not the only coup. In 2019, as you remember, Guaido is calling openly for an uprising against Maduro, supported by the United States. In May 2020, 300 heavily armed volunteers invaded Venezuela with the goal of raid military bases, ignite popular rebellion against the government of Maduro. And this is something that maybe John can explain to us. Is there a relationship with the fact that Saab is held in prison after the Venezuelan government sentenced 2 former American soldiers who participated in the last invasion of Venezuela? Are they holding Alex as in order to swap so-called prisoners? But the coups was not the only tool that the U.S. used. There is military pressure. In the summer of 2020, the U.S. sent Navy ships to the coast of Venezuela to intimidate and to intimidate other countries from delivering oil and supply to Venezuela. In terms of the sanction, we need to remember that the sanctions started in 2006. Supposedly because the government of Venezuela is not collaborating with the United States in the drug war, which is complete nonsense. And then in 2008, Bush blamed Chavez for supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon. Total nonsense, total lies. In 2015, Obama issued a new executive order declaring a national emergency with respect to the unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States posed by the situation in Venezuela. Another total lie. And then the sanction regime accelerated. In 2019, as we said, when the United States recognized Guaido, they also imposed sanctions on the Venezuela State Oil Company, the central bank, and the government. Trump also imposed additional financial sanctions on Venezuela that prohibited access to US financial markets by Venezuela government, including the oil company. And then in 2018, 2020, the Treasury began sanctions against companies from overseas that are doing business with Venezuela, specifically the Russian state oil company and Chinese oil companies that are doing business in Venezuela. This is the context, and I think that's how we need to look also at the case of Alex Saab as part of the pressure of the US government to impose a regime change in Venezuela.
Thank you, Yoav, for that excellent background. I'm thinking our next guest is John Philpot. And John, I think this case, Yoav has explained all the hindrances placed via sanctions on Venezuela for participating in the global economy. And Alex Saab was made an ambassador of Venezuela so that he could travel and conduct business transactions on behalf of the state of Venezuela. And basically, he was a sanctions workaround. And I would argue that's why he's sitting in prison today.
Well, that is the center of it. And extradition is not that complicated. A murderer in Montreal who's in Boston, there's a process for producing a summary of the evidence and having him transferred or surrendered to Canada. I'm in Canada, to stand trial. And it should be routine, but there's lots of exceptions. But you don't study the merits of the case. In other words, whether the person has an alibi. Now, Alex Saab was on a stopover, unplanned stopover, and he was arrested on what they said was a red notice from Interpol. Is actually in the wrong name, and it came out a day later. But he was arrested and held incommunicado from June till December, and the lawyers his lawyers in London, he had a very good team of lawyers who applied and got him in house arrest on the island of Sal in Cape Verde. It's not really, he's not being tortured, but he can't move and he's surrounded by police. But he's in house arrest, he can't go anywhere, and he doesn't have the medical treatment that he needs because he's suffering from cancer. Now, he did not want to be transferred to be sent to the US to stand trial. And he applied locally to the court to have himself released. And then he made a legal application to the regional court of the Economic Community of West African States, which is the court of ultimate jurisdiction, like the Supreme Court in the US for Americans. And this court studied his case very carefully. I read the judgment and said, you got to let him out right away and you got to pay him $200,000. And it was illegal, his arrest. That was on March 15th, 2020. Cape Verde, who is under this tremendous economic pressure from the US. It's a tiny country, and all this money and all these jobs available by the US is trying to have a new out base around Africa, because Africa US is losing out and wants to try and have a military and economic influence on this part of Africa. So anyway, this court ordered him released. They didn't pay attention to him. And remember, he's a diplomat. And
can we just let's just clarify something for the audience, that yes, he's an ambassador. He's a special envoy ambassador of the Venezuelan government appointed by the president. And so you're looking at the United States putting pressure on a country to detain a diplomat And just so the audience is clear, Ambassador Saab was flying, and correct me if I'm wrong, John, flying from Caracas to Iran to procure food and gasoline for Venezuela. And this is where the sanctions workaround is involved in this case.
That's exactly right. And he's a diplomat in transit. He's not accredited to Cape Verde. He's a diplomat in transit. He was going to be extra special representative to the African Union. Now, so he also applied to the United Nations Human Rights Committee, and he was worried about being tortured or being badly treated in the US, just like Julian Assange. His sentence was equivalent to torture, as we recall. And the Human Rights Committee rendered a judgment on the 8th of June saying to Cape Verde, don't extradite him until we study the case on the merits. Cape Verde seems to be ignoring all these judgments. Even they say that the West African court doesn't have jurisdiction, but they went back and argued to change the judgment in late June. They made an application to this court to try and have it overthrown and reversed, and it wasn't. So they accepted this judgment. The lawyers, who are very, very competent, applied to the Constitutional Court to declare it unconstitutional. And this court has to render judgments within 30 days. And they kept putting it off and putting it off. And finally, on the 30th of August, or 31st, I think 31st, they rendered a judgment saying that he could be extradited. And so we're sort of concerned about his immediate extradition, but I must say that his lawyers are not overly, well, they're worried, of course, but they're very, very confident in the recourses that remain and the international campaign to have him released. And so we have to look to the future, and this is why this kind of webinar is extremely important. I want to address some of the legal issues which are going to affect third world other countries in their relationship with the US. Alex Saab is charged with money laundering, where he's supposed to have extorted money from the Venezuelan government in Venezuela. And they laid these charges in a southern Florida district court. And they apparently are getting jurisdiction because some of the co-conspirators lived in Florida. But it's kind of funny saying, you know, the US laying charges for something which, if true, happened in Venezuela. I'm convinced it's not true, because we all know there's a process going on in Mexico right now, and the Saab case is being brought into the issues in the reconciliation which is necessary in Venezuela. Now,
you just said something. Can I just interrupt for a moment? Because you just said something that I find fascinating, and I've probably heard it before, but coming from you, I heard it quite differently. That so the United States claims that Alex Saab was committing criminal activity in Venezuela, where he is a citizen, Colombian born, but now a Venezuelan citizen. And the US is pressing charges based on that. I mean, this has to deal with national sovereignty. These are national sovereignty issues.
That is exactly the point.
At the very least.
That is exactly the point. Now, they have a law that you can't bribe foreign governments. The US does, but that's what they're trying to do. And this relates to the situation of Meng Wanzhou of China. She is the chief financial officer for Huawei, who was on transit, and she was arrested on the 1st of August 2018 for a fraud case in the same dates, 2013, 2014. Here's the context. Huawei negotiated with HSBC Bank, with the senior executives, about a contract with Iran for one of its subsidiaries. And the HSBC knew everything about it. And the US, based on illegal extraterritorial sanctions in forbidding anyone to do business with Iran, HSBC's in Hong Kong, said she tried, by misrepresenting the situation, to commit fraud against HSBC. And remember, Hong Kong is part of China. And they got jurisdiction because for a millisecond, the transaction, the payments went through a New York bank. Now, this has been going on, the extradition case has been going on since August 2018. She's just passed her 1,000 days. And we're having a webinar on this next week, the 22nd, and I will ask Terry to send the announcement around to you because it overlaps relating to sovereignty. And the case is going, there's some possibility of winning the case. And it comes down to Canada trying to act in a sovereign manner with respect to the US. We are in Canada, we suffer, we have bad relations with the US right now, with China right now, because we've detained one of their leading people, leading business persons who are dignified, like Alex Saab, a dignified man, well off, but loyal to the government which he is serving. So,
John, there is another issue that that appears here, because if you are arresting Alex Saab because supposedly he was involved in bribe dealing with the Venezuelan government, you are also questioning the legitimacy of the Venezuelan government in this way. In other words, you are because the Venezuelan government is not arresting Saab. They don't think that Alex Saab committed any crime. On the contrary, he was helping Venezuela. So by arresting him supposedly for involving in crime against the Venezuelan government, they are delegitimizing the Venezuelan government.
Yeah. Well, the U.S. in its extradition policies is not really concerned about being fair. They're concerned about weakening and intimidating. Now, the Alex Saab campaign, which I joined in with this spring, has been doing a lot of activity. And it's very important that the people listening to this, and I know Terry Matson through Sanctions Kill, they sent an emergency delegation to Cape Verde from the June 3rd to June 10th. And it got a lot of press, and they also have an international appeal with 15,000 signatures sent to the President of the US and Prime Minister of Cape Verde, having him released. There's a large archive of materials available. There was a webinar on the 19th of May with the lawyers for Mr. Saab, Mr. Almeida, Mr. Falana, William Kamacaro, and myself, Stanfield Smith, and Sarah Flounders. Massachusetts Peace Action held a webinar on the 10th of August. There's a strong social media campaign, and the Saab defense team is confident of achieving his release. The legal process is far from over. Baltasar Gazan, former well-known of the Audiencia Nacional from Spain, the detention of the Venezuelan diplomat is a barbarity. They want to condemn the process and criticize this. I'm a lawyer, I see judgments, and when you see a judgment which is patched together and doesn't make sense, this is what this constitutional court did. And Cape Verde is not terribly sovereign. It's very small. One can even sort of understand that they're terrified and intimidated by the US. Can't accept it, they should resign. But you understand the pressure that they did. And they wrote this nonsense judgment saying it was constitutional. And the issue is now an international issue. It has to be taken up even more strongly than ever. And it's in the forum, of course, which is being of discussion in Mexico right now. So
So for our audience, what John is referring to is the Venezuelan dialogue happening that Mexico is hosting between the democratically elected government of Venezuela and the opposition. And they just finished their second round here in Mexico, and the third round will be starting in October, I believe. So,
John, I wanted to ask you, can Alex Saab see his family? When the delegation, the international delegation, when they went to Cape Verde, were they able to meet with him?
I understand they did meet them, but I'm not sure of all the details of who met who. I understand he was moved to one of the main islands to see doctors, but some people say that was a fake thing because they're getting ready to transfer him. I don't know the answer to that. He's had a very difficult time, and we don't want him to go to the US because I don't know whether you know the statistics of the federal court system, but they always get their man. The conviction rate is so high in the US District Court. I've been involved in a trial or two in the US as an advisor. And so we do not want him to go to the US. He cannot have a fair trial in the US, whatever anybody says.
Is there a way to slow down the process so that maybe during the negotiation in Mexico between the government and the opposition, a deal will be able to? Well,
I think so, but I mean, I'm not his counsel, so I'm not sure of everything that's going to happen. I know that his lawyers in the US are applying to the court to have the case dismissed because of his diplomatic status. And I think this is a brief going to be filed in about 2 weeks on this. So, but second guessing a court and court results and what's going to happen legally when you're not on the case, I'm humble enough to know that I don't know, because I've done enough litigation myself to know that you don't even know what's going to happen in 2 weeks. But it's certainly far from over. And this is an issue for everybody, every diplomat, every UN person who travels. The US acts above the law in trying to get their hands on people they don't want. It's another branch of their aggression, sanctions policy, hybrid war with, this is another subject, of course, which I think we have to study it, because they don't intervene directly and bomb directly as much as before. But their policy is as aggressive as ever. Sanctions policy, Sanctions Kill has just published its report for the Biden government, Biden administration. And I co-authored it with Rick Sterling and David Paul, and it was distributed yesterday. And we hope to participate in this international debate about sanctions, because it's almost worse than war. It's hard to say.
Worse than a hot war.
It's worse than a hot war. And remember Madeleine Albright saying the sanctions on Iraq, even though it killed 500,000 children, it was worth it.
That's right.
Who can think that? And we know people. Can you imagine?
John, I wanted to ask you about the Y case in Canada. What is the public opinion in Canada about her arrest?
Well, there's a lot of support for her, and there's a lot of propaganda against her. And this issue is being raised. We're having a federal election right now, and they're saying that we cannot let her go because China's arrested the two Michaels, two Canadians working in China who actually have been photographed, and they've photographed military installations, and one guy sent them to the other guy, one of the Michaels sent it to another guy. And these men are allegedly hostages for Meng Wanzhou, but there is an independent trials of these men One man's been convicted and got 11 years. Another man's having his judgment quite soon. But these are spies. Canada, they criticize these as secret trials. But in any country, when there's national security issues, the trials are secret. You know, I mean, Canada has secret trials and secret evidence when there's national security issues at stake. So, so in Canada, there's a very strong campaign and to get her released, and it hurts Canada. Canada in the West, they have a lot of business with one of the biggest, most important business partners for China. We should have a proper relationship, as the US should with China. And history will tell us where we're going. And this is part of our campaign to stop sanctions, because sanctions policy, we are fighting for a multilateral world where you don't have sanctions and that countries deal with one another according to the United Nations charters and not what the US calls or the Canada calls the rules-based international order, which means the power of the mighty. No, the international community is defined by the 1946 Charter of the United Nations, sovereign equality of nations, do not interfere in internal affairs. Sanctions are a crime against humanity when it makes people suffer and the people impose the sanctions intend the results, which they do. They know very well that people are going to die. And this applies to the Caesar sanctions in Syria. It applies to Iran. It applies to Zimbabwe. It applies to Gaza. It applies to North Korea. It applies to Venezuela and so on.
And Cuba.
This is
Cuba for 60 plus years. Yeah.
Yes, of course.
And maybe one can say Haiti for more than 200 years.
Yeah.
Well, so this is
Haitian laugh at the Cuban. They say to the Cuban, "Oh, the sanctions and blockade against you is only 60 years. We are suffering from this heavy-handed for already 200 years."
Well, the U.S. didn't want a black country to be independent. They didn't like that in 1804. But that's another issue, but it's still very important, of course.
I wonder in our closing minutes, if John, we could return briefly to a comment you made about how the Saab case, however the result comes, how the situation that has led up to his arrest, his detainment, and whatever the result of the case is, how it's going to affect, I think you mentioned the third world, and in other countries that aren't 100% aligned with the United States.
Well, when they plan their cases, they do it in the State Department and in the prosecutor's offices, and no one knows about them. The Meng indictment was adopted in January or February 2018, and she got it served on her August 1st, 2018, more or less, okay? The Saab indictment related to events 5-6 years ago, and it came out now, it came out a year and a half ago. So there's probably more hidden and coming up. And there are many ways in which countries are trying to bypass sanctions now. And US sanctions are not that strong. I mean, they're strong and they hurt a lot, but some countries can bypass them a little bit, and they're going to probably bypass them more. So who is next? Businessman. There's a businessman from North Korea whose name I don't know, who was extradited a year ago from Malaysia. It's also very serious because he did business and he broke sanctions against North Korea, and the US got their hands on him. So how many more are there? I don't know, but diplomats are in danger. Businessmen, business persons are in danger. Men, women, persons are in danger, and we don't know. We don't.
You know, John. We can also add the extrajudicial killing that the United States, for example, killing Soleimani in Iraq, or the way Israel is assassinating people it's this kind of being above the law and taking the law to their own hands.
That's certainly true. It's a different issue a bit, but it's the same. It's a phenomenon.
It's that extrajudicial reach.
Mhm.
Yep.
Yeah, where
Anyway.
it's that extrajudicial reach of the United States and the complete lack of respect for the rights and sovereignty of other nations.
Actually, we can even add the murdering of American citizens in Yemen, which was extrajudicial against American citizens.
For
Right?
sure.
The man and his boy who was killed, they were American citizens.
So what have we not addressed regarding the significance of the Saab case? What's the current, he was to be extradited, that has been appealed, and he is not being extradited at this point,
He
or
lost
that's
his
on
appeal.
hold?
He lost his appeal.
He lost it, okay.
What
And
can we do? What can we do, John? What can we do here to help?
the lawyers have plans, and there are other recourses to the UN and to the regional court. I do not know exactly what their plans are because it's a recent event. I know the SAB committee is going to have another conference soon. I don't have the date for it. And people should sign the petition I can send the link for the petition to Terry right now in a few minutes.
We should mention that. Can you read it out loud for our audience so they
Yes.
can hear it?
It's it's the Solidarity Center petition, which is sent to the U.S. President, the President and Prime Minister of Cabo Verde, and I will ask Terry to post it in the next half hour. So I think this is a very ongoing struggle, and we have to strengthen our solidarity, strengthen our fight on this case. We've been on this for 4 or 5 months now, and it's far from over.
How can we help? How can people here in the United States help?
They can sign the petition, and they can contact the SAB committee, and we will have all that information available.
I'll post that in the comments of tonight's broadcast so that all of you can see it there.
Great.
Okay.
Great.
So this is so, it's shocking. I mean, when you talk to US citizens about it, I can't speak for Canada, John, you can. It's people can't even grasp what the case is about, because it's so hard for people to understand and or believe this extrajudicial reach of the United States, this push for one world, one order led by the United States and its principal allies. And that includes everything, militarily, economic, global currency, political, all of it. And it's very hard. I mean, this case is such a great case study in what the United States is attempting to do. And I'm so happy for your time tonight, because it's so important to keep everyone apprised of what's happening and the significance of what's happening. Is there anything that we should address before anything we've forgotten? Anything that?
Well, there's the attempt to bully Africa is a very important aspect, because the African Bar Association, which I know well, has protested. The African Union, he's a delegate to the African Union. Cape Verde, why do they need a $340 million embassy in Cape Verde if it's not to try and control Africa? We know about, and this is something you should study, look at the gray zone on this. the conflict over Ethiopia and Eritrea and the Tigray so-called rebellion, which is not a rebellion, and the attempt to control that strategic area. These are things which progressives and citizens should try and understand. Look at the gray zone, look at the Taylor report in Canada. There's a lot of material because the US is not going to give up easily. They're losing. They're not as strong as they used to be, but they're not down yet, and they have to change their approach to the world. And so, and a lot of people don't realize that this is it's an aggressive power which is trying to control by, I would call them lies. These legal issues are lies, okay? And I mean, obviously we're all concerned about Julian Assange, but and it's extremely important. This is another example of what they're doing to this man who all he did is expose US war crimes in Iraq. That's all he did.
And he's being the push is to extradite him to the United States to stand trial where he isn't even a citizen, he's an Australian citizen.
Yeah.
So that, again, that extrajudicial reach for that US as the world's police, judge and jury, it's quite alarming. And we really have our work cut out for us. And I so appreciate the work that both of you are doing. And so I want to just give the audience two websites, and then I'll also post it in the comments so that you can easily find things as well. But sanctionskill.org is sanctionskill, sanctionskill.org, and you can find, the audience can find the sanctions report that was published yesterday. That is on that site. And then also, John, you mentioned the prior webinar on Alex Saab that Mass Peace Action hosted. That can be found on Mass Peace Action's YouTube channel, and Mass Peace Action on the internet is MASSPEACEACTION.org. And I want to remind our audience that you have been watching What the F is Going On in Latin America, Code Pink's weekly YouTube program of hot news out of Latin America and the Caribbean. We broadcast in partnership with Massachusetts Peace Action, Friends of Latin America, and Task Force on the Americas. And also, you can now find us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And I also want to remind all of you that Code Pink Radio broadcasts every Thursday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern on WBAI out of New York City, and simulcast out of Washington, D.C. on WPFW. So thank you, gentlemen. And I hope that we have a follow-up conversation as this case proceeds. And we'll just keep the audience informed. As this very, very important human rights, economic rights, national sovereignty. I don't know. There's so many issues wrapped into this one man being basically a political prisoner.
Próxima vez lo haremos en español.
Sí, la próxima vez. Okay, thank you, Yoav. Any closing comments you'd like to make?
I would just like to tell our audience that it's important to spread the word about this case, to expose the criminality, the hypocrisy, the lying which is involved in this case, and the danger that John very well explained to us, the implication, the international implication of this case, as the case of the Chinese woman in Canada, in the Y company. So thank you, John. It was great to
thank you.
I enjoy listening to you. Thank you so much, Terry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye.
everyone. We'll see you next week on Code Pink YouTube at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. Good night.
Good night.
Bye.